Hello everyone and welcome back to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. So without further ado, sit back, relax and enjoy. In our small scientific town, everything is imbued with intelligence and a thirst for knowledge. Every other building here houses a world-renowned research institute, laboratory, or national university facility. I grew up in this atmosphere from birth. Both of my parents are also PhD holders. My father is a nuclear physicist, and my mother is a philologist. In general, after graduating from the gymnasium, the question of whether I should become a scientist or not didn't even arise. The only decision was which science to dedicate myself to. I chose biology. Studying how the human brain and other organs work seemed even more fascinating and less burdensome to me than exploring the depths of space or the ocean. I got into the biology department of our university without much trouble and proved to be a gifted student. I excelled academically, participated in national conferences, and even published my first scientific papers in prestigious journals. By the third year, prominent figures in science had begun to notice me. During a break, an elderly man with the stereotypical appearance of a scientist stopped me, old-fashioned glasses with thick lenses, a small gray beard, a hat, a coat, and a cane. "Good afternoon, young man. My name is Victor Greaves, and I'm the chief scientific researcher at the Institute of Cellular and Molecular Biology. I've heard of your achievements and came to you with a proposal. Would you like to work at our institute while continuing your university studies?" he asked with a sly smile. To say I was thrilled would be an understatement. This was the institution where I had planned to build my career and conduct research. But I had not expected the institute itself to invite me to work, especially at such a young age. Struggling to contain my excitement, I responded deliberately calmly, saying I needed to hear the offer conditions and think about it for a day or two. The conditions, of course, were not the most appealing. They offered me a part-time position as a laboratory assistant with a modest salary, to put it mildly. But at that moment, money was secondary to me. The main thing was to prove myself, become part of the scientific community of our town, and make a splash with some project. Money and fame would follow. Putting on the white lab coat on my first day of work, I felt as if I were being knighted or something similar. My new colleagues greeted me warmly, showed me the institute's infrastructure, all the laboratories and offices. All the offices except one. Walking past a massive metal door in the basement, I couldn't help but ask, "What's behind that door?" David, a young scientist who volunteered to be my guide around the institute, seemed taken aback by the question. "That's just a storage area for some old junk. Besides, that room has been abandoned for years. No one's gone in there for ages," he muttered uncertainly and led me further down the corridor. Before leaving, I glanced back at that door, and it didn't look abandoned at all. No rust, no dust, nothing. The next day, after my last class, I practically ran to the institute, immersing myself in work. The routine tasks of a laboratory assistant, preparing charts and reports, sorting documents, and so on, took up a lot of time. And I couldn't neglect my studies. Advancing my research, which I had previously only worked on theoretically, could now only be done in the evenings. The institute had everything I needed for my experiments, reagents. I won't bore you with complicated scientific terminology. I'll just say that if successful, I would contribute significantly to preventing many diseases, including cancer. Every spare moment I spent in the laboratory, conducting one experiment after another. This work captivated me, but I periodically pondered another question: what was behind that massive door? David's explanation didn't seem convincing to me, and other colleagues avoided the question entirely, which only fueled my suspicions further. Victor Greaves reacted particularly oddly to my inquiry. "Young man, you were hired to perform specific duties, not to inventory the premises. Please focus on your direct responsibilities and leave the rest alone." The laboratory where I worked was directly opposite the mysterious door, and through the window, I could observe whether anyone entered or exited it. But during my first month at work, none of the staff even approached it. I had almost begun to believe it was indeed an abandoned storage room. But one day, I became so engrossed in my experiments that I didn't realize I had stayed in the laboratory late into the night. At some point, I heard footsteps in the corridor. Judging by the triple sound, someone was walking with a cane. Victor Greaves, I guessed. Glancing at the clock, I realized that I wouldn't escape a reprimand for staying so late without prior notice. I decided to be clever. I turned off the lights and equipment in the laboratory, partially closed the door, and hid so my boss wouldn't realize someone was still there. But Victor Greaves did not head to the laboratory. Peeking cautiously from the edge of the lab window, I saw him stop at that very same mysterious door. The old man punched a code into the AG keypad and entered a combination. What happened behind the door, I couldn't make out. All I saw was the bright metallic glow of neon lights. Soon, a ghastly sound echoed, a mix of a human moan, the cry of a whale, and something else I couldn't even compare to anything I knew. Shortly after, Victor Greaves emerged, closed the heavy door, and glanced around furtively. I ducked just in time, and he, not noticing me, shuffled back toward the staircase. Deciding I had enough adventures for one day, I waited for a moment, then also headed for the exit and made my way home. That night, I couldn't sleep well. The mysteries had only multiplied, and I firmly resolved to solve them the next day. My plan was simple: stay late in the lab again, and when everyone was gone, sneak into the mysterious room, explore it thoroughly, and leave without a trace. At first, everything went according to plan. My colleagues went home, unsurprised that I was once again the last to stay behind in the lab. Making sure no one was around, I set my secret plan into motion. 8-1-2-9, I keyed in the code, and the heavy cast iron door slowly creaked open. At first, there was nothing remarkable in sight. The small room indeed resembled a shed filled with random junk. Cables were strewn everywhere, old Cold War era devices sat abandoned, and the overall atmosphere felt distinctly outdated. It was a stark contrast to the futuristic interiors of the other offices and labs in the Institute. Disappointed, I was about to leave when my gaze fell upon a large floor-to-ceiling glass panel in the far corner of the room. Pushing my way through the clutter, I approached the glass, and what I saw made my skin crawl. It was nearly impossible to describe the thing in words. It was a mass of pulsating flesh, resembling a giant red caterpillar. However, unlike a caterpillar's symmetrical form, this thing was grotesquely misshapen. Aside from its pulsations, the creature emitted a horrifying sound. At first, it seemed like the repugnant mass was composed of uniform matter, but upon closer inspection, I began to notice anthropomorphic features. In one area, something resembled a twisted mouth filled with teeth. Feeling nausea rise in my throat, I still couldn't tear my eyes away from the horrifying sight. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. "What are you doing here?" A loud shout suddenly snapped me back to reality. At the door stood David, and in my shock, I jerked my elbow, accidentally hitting a lever near the glass. At that moment, the white light in the room turned red, an alarm blared, and the glass began rising rapidly. The red mass fixed its single eye on me and began slithering in my direction. I stumbled backward, tripped over a cable, and fell to the floor. "Get up!" David shouted, running over and helping me to my feet. At that moment, the disgusting creature wrapped both of his legs. David's face twisted in pain. He screamed in agony and collapsed. I scrambled to the wall, horrified, watching as the creature dissolved first his clothes, then the flesh of his legs. Blood sprayed, bones were exposed, and then shattered as the monstrosity devoured him, inching higher and higher. "Help me!" David managed to gasp with his last strength. I grabbed a piece of rebar lying nearby and struck the creature with all my might. It emitted the same horrifying sound, but my blows seemed to have no effect. When almost nothing remained of David, the thing suddenly latched onto my left leg. I never imagined a human could experience such pain. There was no way to pull my leg free, and I started mentally preparing for death when someone suddenly yanked me backward. It was Victor Greaves. The old man managed to pull me free. In a half-conscious state, I watched as he dragged me into the hallway and shut the cast-iron door just as the creature lunged after us. An hour later, I found myself in Victor Greaves' office. He hadn't called an ambulance, but instead applied a tourniquet, bandaged me, and injected a potent painkiller. It seemed he had medical skills rivaling any doctor. "Yes, kid, you've done something truly horrible. But I see no point in punishing you. You're already punished enough," he said, nodding toward my left stump. "Much like I was in my time," he added. Then the old man rolled up his left pant leg, revealing a prosthetic. It now made sense why he limped and always used a cane. Meanwhile, Victor Greaves continued. "Many years ago, during the Cold War times, our institute received a classified government commission. We were tasked with learning how to reanimate dead human cells, in essence, to invent a cure for death. It sounds absurd, but even then, I understood the true purpose of the commission. The country's leaders were becoming increasingly old and frail. Death was knocking at their doors, and to postpone meeting it as long as possible, they were willing to do anything. Funding for this commission was lavish, and we got to work. Experiments. We needed fresh corpses, and prisons, gangs, and serial killers supplied them. We didn't care about their backstories, only about cells from various organs unaffected by decay. I spent countless hours developing a formula that could reverse cellular death. But he endured failure after failure. The dead, of course, did not come back to life. And then, one day, I finished writing another formula on the board and realized, this is it, it should work now. Waiting for the evening, I went into the laboratory behind this cast-iron door alone. I leaned over another corpse and injected my new compound. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. The cells did indeed come to life, but began transforming in the most unexpected way. Just a couple of minutes later, instead of a human body, an ugly, squelching mass of flesh appeared before me. This creature had no consciousness. It was driven only by the desire to satisfy basic instincts, primarily hunger. Once revived, this thing attacked me, and I barely managed to escape, or rather, to escape with only one of my legs. I locked the creature in this room. My colleagues and I made repeated attempts to destroy it, but my compound continued to work. The cells instantly regenerated, which meant that killing it, burning it, shooting it, or poisoning it was impossible. During these attempts, I lost several colleagues. What happened to them was the same as what happened to David today. And here's what I also noticed. With each victim it consumed, this creation became larger and stronger. I suddenly imagined what would happen if it broke free. The very existence of our entire city, and perhaps even the whole world, would be at risk. In general, I decided not to tell anyone else about my terrible experiment and its result, and I strictly forbade any of the staff from entering the room. I don't know how you managed to get in, but I am still glad you at least managed to stay alive. Time passed, and now I realize that telling anyone about what happened that evening is impossible. Victor Greaves and I came up with a story that a truck supposedly ran over my leg and fled the scene. As for the photo of the unfortunate David, supposedly missing, his relatives continued to put up posters around the city for a long time. Of course, I quit the institute and transferred to the first year of the history department at the university. I could no longer work in biology. The memory of that encounter with that terrible creation of human thought still stands in my mind to this day. The story is told from the perspective of a young woman. This tale begins a few days before the English language exam. On that very day, I became an adult, but due to the upcoming events, I decided to celebrate this occasion only with my best friend, Julia. After buying a few bottles of alcohol, we talked about many things, reminisced about Julia's ex-boyfriend, dreamed about a bright future, and discussed the upcoming exam topic I might face. I don't know why, but I had a terrible headache at the time, even though the drinks were of good quality. Perhaps it was the stress from the impending exam that was supposed to determine my fate. I also remember borrowing a sweater from my friend to wear on the day of the exam. This is an important detail to remember. You'll understand why later. As the cherished day approached, an uneasiness grew deep inside me. But it wasn't connected to the exam, as I had been diligently preparing for it all year. This sense of anxiety was incredibly difficult to describe. It was like a black stain in the middle of my mind, pulling all my thoughts into itself, a black hole. Yet, even as I delved into this abyss with all my consciousness, I saw nothing but utter darkness. Many people dismiss such feelings, but I'm not one of them. I believe in science so much that, on the eve of the exam, I even convinced my best friend to remove a skull tattoo from her thigh. It might seem trivial, but believe me, every symbol carries energy, so it's important to rid oneself of negative signs in life. Julia was very dear to me. We had been through thick and thin together, so I couldn't let the symbol of death remain on her body. The long-awaited day arrived, and I faced it sleep-deprived. All night, I simply lay there thinking. A swarm of endless thoughts pierced my mind like countless forks poking a well-cooked piece of meat. When I finally began to clumsily drift into oblivion, the loud ringing of my alarm burned through my body, forcing me to sluggishly get up. However, my determination, along with several cups of coffee, managed to drive away the drowsiness. I don't remember how I got to school. Of course, I recall riding in a stuffy minibus with no windows. Upon arrival, I saw the scene before me, a shapeless mass of students crowded at the school entrance. The building looked neat and tidy, with a small garden and flower beds in front of the entrance. The majority of students were already crunching, like snow, on their prepared cheat sheets. Some had them in their shoes, others in their underwear or bras. One genius even planned to sneak in a phone. Luckily, I didn't need any of that. Finally, the bustling crowd spilled into the building. One by one, the classes passed through the cloakroom, where no one bothered to change shoes, and then to the registration desk. Behind it sat an elderly, grumpy woman who loudly complained about having to check passports. She then monotonously marked a checkbox next to each surname and barely audibly rasped out the room number. 15 minutes later, I entered room 124. The room was quite old. It hadn't been renovated in a long time. Seat numbers were awkwardly taped onto the desks. In the corner stood a rattling laptop, which periodically crackled, emphasizing its cheapness. Some people were already seated. Their eyes were filled with indifference and fleeting thoughts, as if they were attending an ordinary lesson, not a challenging exam. Handing my passport to the organizer, I shifted my gaze to the left. There, at desk 1B, he sat. At first, my mind couldn't identify who it was. A man dressed in a strict black suit, with a tie around his neck. His facial features and expressions were indistinct. The organizer called my name, and the man abruptly turned toward me, directing his crazed eyes straight at me. His mouth was twisted into a sinister grin, and he sat hunched over. This image froze me, as if I were a piece of metal stuck to a magnet. It was so absurd that the organizer had to shake me by the shoulder to get me to take my document. My seat was directly behind this strange man. When the answer sheets were handed out, I finally realized and remembered who he was. He was Julia's ex-boyfriend. The catalyst for their breakup was me. They split because he mistreated my friend and frequently raised his hand against her. Yet now, deep down, it felt like he shouldn't be here, that physically, he couldn't be sitting in this classroom. And no, he wasn't older than me, he had also graduated from 11th grade. The issue was something else, something more ephemeral and elusive. After some time, the monotonous voice of the organizer finished the instructions, and I began working on the tasks. The room filled with the scratching of pens. The questions in the first section were extremely odd. At least, that's how they seemed to me. The words in the questions had meanings unknown to me. I couldn't even read them, which triggered the most horrifying panic. I lifted my head to catch my breath, stretching my neck, and once again, my gaze fell on my strange neighbor. Something was wrong with his silhouette. Tracing his outline in the air with my finger, I couldn't pinpoint where the parts of his body began and ended. They were literally a single piece, and at the joints where there should have been connections, I couldn't see them. I moved my eyes again, this time to the right. I tried to see what he was writing. First, I was simply curious. Secondly, it might help me since, theoretically, the majority of the audience should have the same answer. What I managed to discern pushed my mind into a new level of bewilderment. In the answer fields of the form, the same symbol resembling a skull was drawn repeatedly. Was he completely stupid? Did he come to the exam just to draw skulls? I thought before reluctantly returning to my own tasks. Surprisingly, all the words now appeared familiar. I started solving the problems. The clock loudly ticked the rhythm of time, and, as it seemed to me then, it was ticking too loudly. Finally, the tasks were solved, and only the essay remained. I began reading it. As my eyes moved along the winding paths of the letters, my mind gradually transitioned from confusion to sheer horror. I cannot fully convey the content of that text, it has completely slipped my mind now. But, in brief, it described an event in Germany during World War II where, in a concentration camp, the guards starved a prisoner to death. Afterward, the revived corpse sequentially killed all the camp's inhabitants and consumed them. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. Such a text simply could not have been included in the exam. It described blood, dismemberment, and even the insides of the corpse itself. I reread it several times but ultimately accepted it. I jotted down a few versions in my draft. Suddenly, with a loud crackling sound, my pen fell. Cracking my back as I leaned down, I picked it up and placed it back on the desk. But my attention was again drawn to my neighbor, more specifically, to his legs. First, he was barefoot, no shoes or socks. The ex of my friend was sitting completely barefoot. Secondly, his legs were blue. I felt uneasy then, but I quickly sat back in my seat, as far from him as possible. The person sitting before me was certainly not human. This thought pierced my mind like icy needles. I shifted my eyes an inch downward and noticed that instead of written answers in my draft, there were the same damned skulls that were on my neighbor's form. Horrified, I hurried to cross them out, moving my pen back and forth. I didn't immediately notice when the ink turned from black to crimson red. A moment later, the top of my form was covered in blood. The stench of rot reached my nose. Startled and terrified, I clenched my pen so tightly that it snapped in two. The ink cartridge also broke. It was like the worst nightmare imaginable. My entire body was smeared with blood, from my feet to my face. It disgustingly clung to my skin and reeked. On one hand, I was at one of the most important stages of my life, the exam. Not some unimaginable paranormal activity. I couldn't scream or call the proctor for help. Fear paralyzed me and my throat. All I could do was grab the draft papers and use them to wipe off the blood. The proctors didn't pay the slightest attention to my actions. They sat at the front desk near the computer, their gazes fixed on a single point, empty and lifeless. From the open mouth of one of them, saliva slowly dripped. I needed to at least catch my breath. Perhaps everything that happened around me was just an illusion caused by lack of sleep the previous night. I quietly, almost stealthily, raised my right hand. "May I step out?" The two proctors answered in unison with a drawn-out howl. "Yes, you may." I slowly stood up and headed to the corridor. There, a new shock awaited me. Outside the window, there was pitch-black darkness. All the clocks in the corridor showed midnight. The hallways were empty, devoid of people, and all sounds had disappeared. It felt as if the entire building had plunged into eternal twilight. Everything happening more and more resembled both a strange and terrifying dream. I walked a few meters and collapsed onto the floor. My strength and sanity were gradually leaving me. Only the pink sweater, borrowed from Julia, warmed my soul in this blood-freezing abyss. I just lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling. I lay there, thinking, could this all be divine punishment for my sins? Could it be that I have ended up in hell? But what did I do, Lord? Prayers swept through my mind like a hurricane. It was after these thoughts that a feeble roar echoed from the lecture hall. "You may." Then I heard the measured sound of bare feet slapping against the floor in the hallway. Faster than thunder, I sprang up from the cold floor and ran to the restroom. Throughout the entire route, I heard the cursed sound of those slapping feet behind me. In a moment, I was inside the women's restroom. My consciousness was teetering on the edge of oblivion. I thought that the door would be broken down in seconds, and after that, a lifeless body and a floor drenched in blood would be found. But unexpectedly, after a while, I heard a distinctly human voice. "Let me in." I hesitated, pacing from one corner to the other. "Why?" I asked in a trembling voice. "I have cheat sheets," the same voice replied from behind the door. Slowly and hesitantly, I lowered the handle of the door. There he was, my terrifying neighbor. Acting as if nothing unusual had happened, he walked into the restroom and asked, "What topic did your essay turn out to be on?" In a state of stupor and complete incomprehension of what was happening, I recounted to him the horrific plot of my essay. He simply laughed in response. I looked at him in bewilderment. Sensing my questioning tone, he said, "That's easy. My tutor and I have gone over this text 100 times. And what's the problem here? Where's the author's stance? To me, this is just a bunch of gore." Forgetting what had just happened, I entered into the discussion. "I think the problem lies with the uneaten monsters. The author's stance is simple: all the monsters should be eaten alive." He retorted mockingly. A dissonance arose in my head once more. Everything happening around me felt more like a dream, but my interlocutor's words seemed like salvation from all my problems. After all, I was here to take an exam. "And what text did you get?" I asked in a half-whisper. "I got one about a boy who ended up in the looking glass and met a creature there that means people," he said with enthusiasm. "And what's the author's stance on that?" "The stance? That informed minds have no business wandering through the looking glass and disturbing the natural order of things, just like you do, you little bitch." After these words, his eyes turned black, and his faint smile stretched into a terrifying grin. My soul instantly sank to my heels. I pierced the oppressive silence with a blood-curdling scream. However, the sound was swallowed by some unknown force, and all that came out was a squeak. Meanwhile, the fiend began stretching his limbs. His clothes started tearing, revealing numerous skulls underneath, resembling those he had sketched on his exam paper. They appeared to have been carved into his grotesque body with a knife and were vividly red. Like a typhoon, the monster sank its long yellow teeth into my wrist. Adrenaline hit my head with the force of a baseball bat. I kicked him. After that, the attacker unexpectedly dissolved into thin air. Pieces of his body fell to the floor, including his head. In the blood pool, the substance swarmed with insects that crawled toward me. At that moment, I ran with all my might, but my escape was halted. My sweater had snagged on the door handle. In the chaos, it took me several tries to remove it. And then, there was only impenetrable darkness. I woke up in the medical office. I found my wrists bandaged. They showed me the camera recordings. In them, I was sitting with my eyes closed, as if enchanted, cutting my own wrist with a makeshift blade made from a broken pen. And there was absolutely no one in front of me. They scheduled me for a makeup day. On that day, I passed the exam. Everything went smoothly. One could say the story ended there. However, one day, it became clear to me what it all had been. On social media, I visited the page of my friend's ex-boyfriend and was horrified. Her ex-boyfriend had committed suicide shortly before the exam because of their breakup. And that pink sweater, it was a gift from him to Julia.